This is your argument against it? This is your argument against it. This is so stupid. Oh, I can't, I'm losing it. I'm losing it. This, Hi everyone, thanks for joining me again as I trudge through this book. We're supposed to be learning if Jesus really rose from the dead, or whether the authors just believe that there's more evidence that Jesus rose from the dead as opposed to more evidence that not Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not 100% sure if the authors understand how the burden of proof works, or really what atheists actually think, or how they arrived at their conclusions. I would love it if you guys would pause the video and post your predictions. Some of you guys really nail it, and honestly, I'm not sure where it's going to go from here. My only guess is that it's going to be basically a rehash of chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10, remember, we were talking about, or the authors were talking about, did we really have early writings around the time of Jesus, and we could assume that they were eyewitnesses. And then with the chapter 11 argument, it was basically that we could trust what the eyewitnesses wrote down because a list of reasons, some of which were they wrote about things that happened that we could verify, so all the things we can't verify must also be accepted as true, and the argument that they could have recanted but they didn't and they were martyred, which of course we don't really have any evidence of that anyway, but it's just kind of church tradition. And also one of the weirdest arguments I've seen was that because they didn't make this already miraculous stuff more fantastical, we can trust that they were telling the truth. It's bizarre. And I think that's all we're gonna get out of chapter 12. That's my prediction. Let's find out. All right, chapter 12, let's go ahead and get our migraine generators on. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? We have a quote here from Gary Habermas. Skeptics must provide more than alternative theories to the resurrection. They must provide first-century evidence for those theories. I'm not sure exactly why the authors included this, because their whole thing is really just a longer way to say Pascal's wager. They're trying to argue that because this seems more likely, we should believe it. What seems more likely? People wrote down something that either they believed to be true or some kind of fantastical legend that over time got turned into a real belief. Maybe this was just a legend, or it was supposed to be some kind of story that would help us, like a fable, to help us learn something. You know, the idea of that Jesus is here to just help us out and be nice, and he's actually God in disguise. And then because of people's inherently sinful nature, we actually killed him and criticized him, like that one Jack Chick track where it talks about they hated Jesus because he told them the truth. That, I think, would be a pretty interesting story, wouldn't it? Just by itself, as a lesson to learn. That could have, over time, got misunderstood as a thing that really happened, and we really have to have beliefs based on this thing that allegedly really happened. That would be more reasonable to assume was the case than to assume, oh, a God really visited Earth in human form, was crucified, but overcame death and was resurrected into the same crucified body. Which, by the way, if my body's already beaten from crucifixion, do you really think I want to resurrect back into that thing? I would hope that all the bruises and everything would be gone and all the broken bones would be gone, but he still had, what, the nail holes that were in his hands or in his wrists? So obviously this wasn't like a resurrected fixed body, right? Do you really want to resurrect into the same busted body that just got beaten up and nailed to a cross a day and a half later? No, that's a silly story. But we assume that this happened. That's going to be the more reasonable assumption, instead of, oh, it's a fable, instead of it was just the people that were mistaken. I know we're kind of going Occam's razor here, but again, that's kind of what the authors are trying to get us to believe, that it's more reasonable to believe in Jesus because of things that they can't really demonstrate are true, compared to it's more reasonable to not believe in Jesus. So if we're going to go for things that are more reasonable, aren't any of those possibilities more reasonable? Just off the top of my head, I don't have to go find evidence from the 1st century. As I've mentioned in the previous videos, we already have evidence of people who lie, know they're lying, but when interrogated, they double down on their lie. We've already seen that people will elaborate on things just in their own head, not realizing that they're doing this. They will misremember, or they will kind of go along with a belief because they already believe it. We've already seen that in cults. That's It's just people. That's what people do. Anyway, the resurrection. What do scholars say? Gary Habermas has completed the most comprehensive investigation to date on what scholars believe about the resurrection. Habermas collected more than 1,400 of the most critical scholarly works on the resurrection written from 1975 to 2003. In The Risen Jesus and Future Hope, Habermas reports that virtually all scholars from across the ideological spectrum, from ultra-liberals to Bible-thumping conservatives, agree that the following points concerning Jesus and Christianity are historical facts. I don't like this phrasing. They're trying to argue that because ultra-liberals, which they've been kind of negative about in earlier chapters, and then Bible-thumping conservatives, they're trying to say, well, because they agree on this, obviously it's going to be true, but that's not really how facts and evidence work, you know what I mean? Things aren't true because we agree from different walks of life that those things are true. They're true because we can demonstrate that they're true. So number 1, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Number 2, he was buried most likely in a private tomb. This one is really interesting just because that's not how crucifixion victims were buried. They weren't given a private tomb. It's a bit convenient that the one guy who gets the private tomb is also the guy who walked out of it. A little bit convenient for the story. Soon afterwards, the disciples were discouraged, bereaved, and despondent, having lost hope. Number 4, Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his internment. Number 5, the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. I like that they phrased it that way because I can even agree with that. Number 6, due to these experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. They were even willing to die for their belief. Number 7, the proclamation of the resurrection took place very early from the beginning of church history. Number 8, the disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly before. Number 9, the gospel message centered on the preaching of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Number 10, Sunday was the primary day for gathering and worshiping. Number 11, James, the brother of Jesus, and a skeptic before his time, was converted when he believed that he also saw the risen Jesus. Number 12, just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus, aka Paul, became a Christian believer due to an experience that he also believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. Now, I am going to check their footnote here. Near the end of the book, that's where we find all of these footnotes. And notice that chapter 12, did Jesus really rise from the dead? The part where it says that Paul believed that he had experience with the risen Jesus, I was looking for the exact verse. They wrote, Habermas, Risen Jesus and Future Hope, 9 to 10. They couldn't even get it from the Bible? This is the part that really upsets me about apologists, is they think that the Bible requires interpretation to the point that even when they could cite the Bible, they don't. They cite other apologists. That's ridiculous. It's the same argument that you hear about the Quran, and you have to read it in Arabic, and if you don't understand it, you have to ask for somebody to interpret this for you. And there's people that's their actual job, is to understand and interpret the Quran. Yeah, I would say they're basically apologists. This is ridiculous, right? Why wouldn't they just cite the Bible? Even here, for the rest of these that we've just read, we have Gary Habermas, which of course, you know, they did cite his book. And number 2, while scholars are not unanimous on the empty tomb, a majority of them, about 75%, believe the tomb was empty. The other 11 facts stated here are nearly unanimous scholarly support. Oh, interesting. Wait a minute. Let's go back to that section. Okay, here we are. Number 4, Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his internment. 25% of people disagree with that. With this little footnote, I had just assumed that they were going to cite that verse of the Bible, right? To show that this is where it came from. But instead, we see here that virtually all scholars from across the ideological spectrum agree that the following points are actual historical facts. What I'm assuming here is that they're talking about the people who do agree, and this is what they agree on. But even in that, we're adding in, oh yeah, by the way, a full 25%. Would you consider 75% to be virtually all of something? If I ate 75% of a pizza, would I phrase it as I ate virtually all of the pizza? No, I'd say, well, I ate most of it, but I left you some. I wouldn't say that virtually all of the pizza is gone. That's makes me wonder, should we have just checked every single time that they put a little footnote? Because I thought they were making references to either specific books where they got this information from or specific Bible verses. But instead, they're adding in, oh, by the way, yeah, you know, this thing, they don't really believe it. Not everybody. Not virtually all, like we said. We said virtually all, but in this case, no, not really. Wow, interesting. I wonder if they were kind of banking on that people that are reading it are going to be assuming, oh yeah, it's just, you know, some reference. The acceptance of these facts makes sense in light of what we've seen so far. The evidence shows, number one, the New Testament story is not legend. The New Testament documents were written well within 2 generations of the events by the eyewitnesses or their contemporaries, and the New Testament storyline is corroborated by non-Christian writers. In addition, the New Testament mentions at least 30 historical figures who would have been confirmed by sources outside the New Testament. Therefore, the New Testament story cannot be legend. We already talked about that. Cults can create their own legends. The stuff that's being written down, it's not necessarily being disseminated to everyone. The people who are reading it want to believe it or also believe it, so they're not going to say, oh, these people are lying about you. And even if they were talking about these major historical figures and a person did believe, oh my goodness, how can you lie about the emperor? That person isn't going to go run and tell the emperor. They're not going to go run and tell even a guard necessarily. It doesn't really make sense to say, oh, it is not legend because real people are included. That's often people bring up Spider-Man because some events in Spider-Man are true and some locations in Spider-Man are true. Therefore, Spider-Man must be real. The New Testament story is not a lie. The New Testament writers included divergent and embarrassing details, difficult and demanding sayings, and they carefully distinguished Jesus' words from their own. These are all things that we mentioned last time that happen in police interrogations, that people will lie, and they think that by including embarrassing details, it gives them a reason that they should be taken seriously, because otherwise, why would they include that embarrassing thing about cheating on their wife, right? The idea about difficult and demanding sayings, we touched on that as well in the last chapter, how that's what most religions require. They require a lot of things that are demanding, or some things were written down and they sound really profound, but they're kind of hard to understand, and they take a lot of thought to really make sense of it. That's just kind of part of religion. And then also carefully distinguishing Jesus' words from their own. I still don't really understand what they mean by this, that they have to emphasize Jesus said versus I said. The most that the authors really explained is that they didn't want to put words into Jesus' mouth, but we still don't know that. Just because they distinguished his words, it doesn't mean that he actually said those words. And this is assuming, again, that there's an actual Jesus who, let's even say that he really was the Son of God who resurrected. That doesn't mean that the authors wrote his words accurately just because they differentiated Jesus's words. I mean, isn't that just how you tell a story? They also referenced facts and eyewitnesses that their readers would either already know or could verify. Again, those eyewitnesses, those are not people that they could verify. Being told that this high leader or this of the, let's say, of the Sanhedrin, that person was witness to this, I'm not going to necessarily be able to go and talk to that guy and ask. He might be dead by the time this was put to paper. In fact, the New Testament writers provoked their readers and prominent first century enemies to check out what they said. How am I going to go verify an eyewitness who lives in a town hundreds of kilometers away without a name? Or the person might be so famous that I don't even think I could ever actually encounter them. That's like saying, oh yeah, go talk to Elvis Presley about this thing. Well, Elvis had already died. And even if he was alive, that doesn't mean I could just go ask Elvis. So by including these very prominent first century enemies, that doesn't mean I can actually go talk to them. So it's just a really, really bad argument for so many reasons. If that's not enough to confirm their truthfulness, it's not. Then their martyrdom should remove any doubt. It doesn't. These eyewitnesses endured persecution and death for the empirical claim that they had seen, heard, and touched the risen Jesus, yet they could have saved themselves by simply denying their testimony. Citation needed. That's the big problem with this. They don't actually cite where this came from. They could just put a little boop for. The New Testament story is not an embellishment. The New Testament writers were meticulously accurate, as evidenced by well over 140 historically confirmed details. They recorded miracles in those same historically confirmed narratives, and they did so without apparent embellishment or significant theological comment. What I mentioned in the previous video was that the miracle is the embellishment. We don't have to overly embellish the miracle. A guy rising from the dead is enough. So is the New Testament true? Well, if most scholars agree with the 12 facts stated above because the evidence shows that the New Testament story is not a legend, a lie, or embellishment, then we know beyond a reasonable doubt that the New Testament writers accurately recorded what they saw. Does this mean that all of the events of the New Testament are true? Not necessarily. The skeptic still has one last out. I don't need a last out because we know that legends develop in the lifetime of cult leaders. We know all of the reasons that they listed are not good enough reasons to assume somebody isn't lying. Now, I'm of the opinion personally that these guys were just in a cult, that they misremembered, and they just mentally added their own embellishments without realizing they were adding their embellishments. So I don't think they were lying, but I think I've made a pretty strong case for why all of the reasons the authors think it's not a lie don't apply. And then the embellishment thing, the miracle is the embellishment. I don't think they've made any good case, but they're still saying we have one last out. So our last out, what is it? The last possible out for the skeptic is that the New Testament writers were deceived. In other words, perhaps the New Testament writers simply were wrong about what they thought they saw. Okay, so this does address something that I hold to. Given the characteristics of the New Testament that we have reviewed, it does not seem plausible that the New Testament writers were deceived about everyday non-miraculous events. Nobody's arguing that. I'm not arguing the topography of where Luke walked. I'm not saying he was deceived that, oh, there is a hill, but there's not actually a hill. I'm not... What? They have been proven right about so many historical details. Why doubt their observation about everyday events? Okay, great. But were they deceived about miraculous events like the resurrection? Perhaps they really believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, and that's why they paid with their lives, but they were mistaken or fooled. Perhaps there are natural explanations for all the miracles that they think they saw. Critical scholars leave themselves this out. Consider fact number 5 from a dozen facts that nearly all scholars believe. The disciples had experiences that they believed were not actual appearances of the risen Jesus. Okay, cool. So that's the one that I mentioned, that I like the phrasing. In other words, the scholars were not necessarily saying Jesus actually rose from the dead, although some think he did. The minimal consensus of nearly all scholars is that the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. For the eyewitnesses and contemporaries of the events to be wrong, there must be some other explanation for the resurrection and the other miracles recorded in the New Testament. Since the resurrection is a central event in Christianity, let's begin there. I agree. How do skeptics explain away the resurrection? I've already done that. Hopefully they get to it, because you guys know that's where I'm at. They really believed it. They were willing to accept different explanations just because they were in a cult. They already were invested. The end. Especially because some of them did leave their jobs. They left their families. These are people who had a lot invested in the hope that this is true, and then their cult leader is executed. That's horrifying. Put yourself in their shoes. These were people that left their hometowns. They left the people they willingly abandoned their families. They walked away and trusted in this guy. And this guy, as far as they understood, showed them things about themselves and about reality that were so beautiful, so divine, that they had no choice but to believe this guy is either of God or God himself. They were so enraptured by being in his presence. And then he's captured and they don't know what to do. They're scared of death. They also don't want to abandon him. But you know what? If he is divine, it's not really going to be a big deal. He seemed pretty accepting of the whole ordeal anyway. Maybe this is part of some plan. And they ran away, and then he was beaten and executed publicly. Imagine the guilt that you would feel about this. That you basically left your guy to die. Maybe you couldn't have escaped the Roman authorities, but you could have at least died next to him. That he at least didn't have to die alone. That you could have been there for him as he was there for you. And now he's gone. Imagine the guilt and the shame and the absolute engulfing sadness. And then imagine somebody says, he's actually not dead. I went to his tomb and he's gone. He's alive. Imagine the relief. You would just really want to believe that this happened. And even if you saw somebody, maybe he believed that he was going to be the next embodiment of Jesus, which we see in cults today. There are people who believe they're the next incarnation of Christ. If you get somebody who believes enough in Jesus as the cult leader, and that he's coming back, and you have this horrible nightmare about his suffering, and then you believe somehow, because of what happened in that dream, that was a message that he has come back to inhabit your body. And you might look just enough like Jesus with people who just want to believe it enough. We know stigmata happens. We know that the people who say this is a miracle, this is stigmata, we know that there are people who make these claims. It's self-injury that they're not necessarily aware of. I'm not saying they do it on purpose to be deceptive, but this is a form of self-injury that happens under the guise of like a divine experience. And so you see somebody walking the streets that looks just enough like Christ, and he has just the right wounds, the obvious wounds. You're not going to look and check all the whip marks, right? I kind of made that joke at the beginning of this chapter that why would you resurrect into the same busted body? But there's no discussion of Jesus's busted body. There's a discussion of the crucifixion wounds in the sense of the nails. They don't talk about how his fresh wounds oozed through his garments. They just talk about what we would know as the stigmata. That makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? This is far more reasonable, because we already have evidence that people believe this today. We already have evidence of the stigmata today. Isn't that far more reasonable than God himself came down to earth one time, was killed, but came back, wandered around, and after about a month or so, he ascends into heaven. That's it. And why? Because he crafted us in a way he doesn't like, making us inherently sinful. So to save ourselves from the hell that he created, he sent himself down to die and then be undied. And then he goes back into heaven physically somehow, even though heaven's not a place for physical bodies. He physically goes into heaven, and that's to make sure that you're saved, but only if you believe it's true. Does that even sound like a reasonable theology? I don't think so. That's why I left. So out of these two, which one sounds more reasonable? The one that we have evidence for happening in modern time today, or the thing that not only we have zero evidence for, but also doesn't even make sense? So let's see what the authors have to say about this. I also wonder if the authors are going to touch on what I just said. Skeptical about skeptical theories. Here are explanations for the resurrection most frequently offered by skeptics. Number 1, the hallucination theory. Were the disciples deceived by hallucinations? Perhaps they sincerely thought they had seen the risen Christ, but instead were really experiencing hallucinations. This story has a number of fatal flaws, and we'll address 2 of them. The one that I don't like about this, it would imply that multiple individuals needed to have grief hallucinations. I don't think that's possible. The way that it would kind of play out is if a couple of them or one of them had this hallucination, this grief-born hallucination, and then told other people who, again, really, really wanted to believe it's true because the grief, the guilt, etc. Then those people just kind of went with it because they trusted their buddy. Oh yeah, if he says he saw him, then why would I question that? Obviously, Jesus told us that death is not the end and he's going to come back, etc., etc. And our buddy here that we trust, I know this guy's a good guy. He's not, crazy. He's not out of his mind. He's not a liar. I trust that he had this experience. I trust that he saw Jesus and spoke to Jesus. Cool. Too bad I wasn't hanging out with him and I missed it. But man, what a relief that Jesus is still around. I think that would be more reasonable, as opposed to each of the disciples had some kind of hallucination, or there was a mass hallucination of, due to ergot poisoning or something. Some interesting mushroom risotto, and the mushrooms were, oops. Hallucinations are not experienced by groups, but only individuals. In that regard, they're a lot like dreams. That's why if a friend said to you one morning, wow, that was a great dream we had, eh? You don't say, yeah, it was fabulous, should we continue it tonight? Well, that's just a weird thing to say anyway. When do you continue your dreams? No, you think your friend has gone mad or is just cracking a joke. You don't take them seriously because dreams are not collective experiences. Individuals have dreams, groups do not. Hallucinations work the same way. If rare psychological conditions exist, an individual may have a hallucination, but his friends will not. And even if they do, they will not have the same hallucination. They italicized rare. If rare psychological conditions exist. So first of all, they're not even accepting that psychological conditions that cause hallucinations exist. They're saying if these exist and they're rare. The other thing that they're failing to understand, and this is a big one about people who don't want to accept that perhaps they were mistaken due to a hallucination. This is the one that they'll say, well, I'm not crazy. Hallucinations just happen, guys. They happen for a lot of reasons. They happen because you're tired. They happen because you didn't have enough food that day. You had too much caffeine. You've been awake for way too long. You're not receiving enough stimuli. That doesn't mean that you have a rare psychological condition. It just means that the human brain isn't very good when there's not enough stimuli. It also isn't very good when it's not given the optimal conditions that it needs to function. So this idea that a hallucination must only happen if you have a rare psychological condition, that's not the case. There's also cases of a psychosis where a person who previously doesn't have any mental illness or any mental illness that would cause hallucinations, they develop sort of a, I don't want to use the phrase mental break, but right now, just in the moment, I can't think of a better way to phrase it. But there's an event that'll happen. And this event can be a type of trauma, like, I don't know, watching the guy that you devoted your life to get crucified and you didn't stop anybody and didn't even attempt to stop anybody. You ran away like a scared little rat. That could do it. Or it could be stuff like, there are cases where people have like a drug-induced psychosis, or even in some cases, postpartum depression can trigger a psychosis. Psychosis isn't something that you're necessarily going to live with for the rest of your life. It's not a forever thing. So you can endure, experience this short-lived time period where you're basically not in your right mind. And then you go back to your right mind. And then there's, grief hallucinations, which I mean, I don't know off the top of my head how common these are. It's not something I've ever experienced, but I'm still under the camp that if the hallucination thing happened, it's because they were just not eating well, not sleeping well, they were having a bad time. And any piece of this could be Jesus. They thought they heard his voice. They thought they smelled him. Because hallucinations can be visual, but they can also be audible. You can suddenly taste something, you can smell things, you can feel things, like a hand on your shoulder, or the room suddenly gets warmer or colder, and then maybe if you feel that and you smell something that smells similar to Jesus, that is a hallucination experience that you could attribute to Jesus sending you a message. If you're really, really wanting to believe that this is true, I don't see why this is an unreasonable thing that could have happened. The hallucination theory doesn't work because Jesus did not appear once to just one person. He appeared on a dozen separate occasions in a variety of settings to different people over a 40-day period. He was seen by men and women. He was seen walking, talking, and eating. He was seen inside and outside. He was seen by many and a few. A total of more than 500 people saw the risen Jesus. That's that stuff from Paul, the 500 unnamed that you can just go ask, which none of you are going to go ask, and who would you ask? Because I didn't name any of them. And they were not seeing a hallucination or a ghost, because on 6 of the 12 appearances, Jesus was physically touched and or he ate real food. See table 12.1 on the next page. Cool. And the existence of the empty tomb is the second fatal flaw with the hallucination theory. The authors actually mentioned this, I think it was, chapter 10 or chapter 11, that there was a Roman explanation circulating that if anybody makes this claim that Jesus arose, let them know that his followers stole the body. And the authors wrote down, see, this is how we know that this is true, because anybody reading this or hearing this would know that this was a rumor that was happening at the time. And I mentioned, if I was going to do something shady, I would make up what my opponent was going to say. Because it actually did happen. I did steal the body. I'm gonna say I overheard them saying to just lie about it and just say somebody stole the body. I don't necessarily agree that because the tomb is empty, that means that Jesus was resurrected. So again, if we can demonstrate the tomb was empty, cool. The accounts that we have of it, they don't really match up. We went over that in the previous video. But besides that, yeah, the tomb is empty. That doesn't mean that he was resurrected. They already gave themselves an out, that if anybody says we stole the body, oh, it's because they made it up. They're lying about it because they don't want to accept that Jesus really did resurrect. They kind of gave away the game with that one, you know what I mean? The next one, what is this, part 2? The witnesses went to the wrong tomb. I actually haven't heard this one. Have you guys? Maybe the disciples went to the wrong tomb and then they assumed Jesus had risen. This theory also has 2 fatal flaws. First, if the disciples had gone to the wrong tomb, the Jewish or Roman authorities would have gone to the right one and paraded Jesus' body around the city. Why? Why would they have paraded his body around the city? That doesn't... What? I think the authors are overselling how big early Christianity was. They could easily just say, no, here's his head, he's still in our custody, knock it off, go back to your jobs and start paying taxes again. I mean, why would they need to parade his body around the city? They could just put his dead body in a public square. Why do they need to parade it around the city? I don't see Christianity, early, like the Jesus portion of the Christian story, of early Christianity. So I don't know if I want to call it Christianity, because Jesus wasn't necessarily trying to start a new religion or anything. Definitely wouldn't have called it Christianity. So that part of Christianity, I think the authors are really overblowing how impactful and popular it was. I think this was supposed to just be yet another cult that went a little too far. They punish the leader, just like we punish leaders today. There's plenty of cult leaders, and I gave some examples in the previous video. It's not unusual to punish cult leaders because they're doing something detrimental to society, especially to the people that are part of the cult. I just think this one happened to gain traction. That was the only difference. I don't think there was anything remarkable about Christianity other than the fact it got popular. That's my stance on it. So I don't think they would have paraded anybody's body. That just like, hey, knock it off. If we hear you guys talking about it, you know, you're gonna get thrown in the brig for a couple days. You know what I mean? The tomb was known by the Jews because it was their tomb. It belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. And the tomb was known by the Romans because they placed guards there. As William Lane Craig notes, the wrong tomb theory assumes that all of the Jews and Romans had a permanent kind of collective amnesia about what they had done with the body of Jesus. Let's find out where number 4 takes us, this footnote 4. Nothing special, just that William Lane Craig is being cited. Okay. Anyway, on this page, this is where we see table, 12.1, something like that. And it just talks about saw, heard, touched, other evidence, the empty tomb. And it looks like, oh, okay, the X here means like a check. Yes, they did. I thought X meant no, they didn't. So empty tomb, grave clothes. We see a couple asterisks. Offered himself to be touched, and then also the single asterisk was implied. So it's implied that James heard Jesus. It was implied that 500 brethren heard Jesus, and it says 500 brethren definitely saw Jesus. The order of the 12 appearances of Christ. So here again, this is that one that is just Paul saying, yeah, if you don't believe me, you guys can ask. Like, there was like 500 guys. So just like, there's like 500. So obviously it's true. Paul here as well about seeing and hearing him. He's not going to touch him because at best it's a hallucination, right? There are some people saying that Paul had a seizure. I don't know about that, but it wasn't that Jesus physically walked up to Paul and said, hey bro, check it out, stop killing my dudes. It wasn't like a physical version, it was a vision. Second, even if the disciples did go to the wrong tomb, the theory does not explain how the risen Jesus appeared 12 different times. Well, again, I don't know if he appeared 12 different times. He's not appearing to Paul, and he didn't appear to the 500 brethren. You know, and again, since Paul is the author of 1 Corinthians, I don't even see why we should, if he's already going to make such a grand lie, I don't see why we should also accept his statement about James. Paul to me is not really a reliable narrator for this particular thing because what he said is so commonly said by liars, so I wouldn't believe him about James. I'm not saying Paul in general is necessarily lying about everything. I'm just saying about this statement, I'm not going to take him seriously. Notice that the empty tomb did not convince most of the disciples, with the possible exception of John, that Jesus had risen from the dead. It was the appearances of Jesus that turned them from scared, scattered, skeptical cowards into the greatest peaceful missionary force in history. Yeah, tell my ancestors about that peace. They just know the force. This is especially true of the devout enemy of Christianity, Saul, aka Paul. He was not only unconvinced by the empty tomb, he was persecuting Christians very soon after the resurrection. It took an appearance of Jesus himself to turn Paul around. It seems that James, the skeptical brother of Jesus, was also converted after an appearance of Jesus, as claimed by Paul. As we have seen, James's conversion was so dramatic that he became the leader of the Jerusalem church and was later martyred at the hands of the high priest. Is this something they ever mentioned was verified outside of the biblical context? The bottom line is this: even if one could explain the empty tomb naturally, this would not be enough to disprove the resurrection. Any alternative theory of the resurrection must also explain away the appearance of Jesus. The wrong tomb theory explains neither. I agree, I don't think this is a very strong one, which is probably why it was included. I've never heard an atheist make this comment. Have you guys? And since their only source that they cited of, this is what the skeptics say, is William Lane Craig. Swoon or apparent death theory. Is it possible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross? Perhaps Jesus merely swooned. In other words, he was still alive when he was placed in the tomb, but he somehow escaped and convinced his disciples that he had risen from the dead. There are numerous fatal flaws with this theory as well. I've heard of this one, especially because there were people who we thought were dead, but they weren't dead. Death wasn't super well understood. And if you do something like hold your fingers to get a pulse, but you only hold it for 10 seconds, but their heart rate is incredibly slow, you may not catch the pulse. If their heart rate is very weak, you're not going to catch the pulse. And so they're not responding to stimuli. You yell at them, you poke them, you can't feel their pulse, you just assume they have died. And whatever the conditions under which you found them, it's reasonable for you to make that conclusion. And this is how we get those people that are buried alive, which is really creepy, right? So I have heard this death theory, this apparent death theory, and I don't think it's anything unreasonable to assume. And it might be something that kind of explains why the guards might have abandoned their post. You think this guy's dead, and you're posted here because you don't want disciples coming in and messing with things. You're probably gonna talk to the other guard. You gotta pass the time somehow. And you're probably gonna ask, do you believe that this guy's like the Son of God? I don't know. So why are we posted here again? Man, they think he's gonna resurrect. Resurrect. Well, I mean, not really resurrect. That his disciples think he's gonna resurrect, right? So we gotta be here so they don't come take the body so they can claim that he resurrected. Okay. I don't know. Do you believe in any of that stuff? Believe in what stuff? What if he was God? I'm not saying he is, but what if? And then they're gonna have this conversation. That's only natural. You know what I mean? They will have this conversation. And then if Jesus actually hadn't died, he wakes up and he starts pounding and screaming, "Let me out of here." Those guards are gonna pass out. They're gonna run away. They're gonna freak out. Do you know what I mean? They may even open the tomb to double check. Did you hear something? I don't know. No, shut up, man. That didn't happen. No, I heard something. I swear I heard something. Shut up, man. You're creeping me out. You're creeping me out. And then you hear bump, bump, bump. And they both scream. And yeah, maybe one of them faints. Okay. The other one might run off. This would give us the guards passed out scenario that is mentioned in one of the Gospels, but they said they passed out because the angels had caused it. If you're the disciple, or if you're, let's say Mary, walking up, getting ready to cleanse the body and prepare it for burial, you see two dudes passed out. And you're like, whoa, what's going on here? And you might get somebody to help you kind of roll the rock. And there he is. He's standing in front of you. Jesus is just right there, standing there. And he says, "Oh, I knew somebody would come for me. Thank you." Something like that. That's reasonable for the apparent death theory. Another one that's reasonable for the apparent death theory is, again, they're banging, or Jesus is banging on the inside of the tomb. The guys run off, and the disciples show up with the women to cleanse the body, but also to provide them some kind of moral support, or just out of guilt, or they need to really confirm that he's actually dead. And they see there's no guards, they roll away the rock. Could also happen that the guards didn't run away and they didn't pass out because they're freaking guards. They're like the Roman military. They're not going to be, it's like putting Marines there. You know what I mean? We're not going to sit here and scream and cry, run away and pass out just because something spooky happens. There are some that would. But mostly we're not going to do that, right? So if I hear some banging from the inside of the tomb, I don't know what I'm thinking at this point. I'm thinking this guy, I don't know, came back from the dead or what. Maybe he wasn't dead. I don't know. I'm going to try to open the tomb. And if they open the tomb just confirm that no, we're just hearing things, he is dead, I'm going to get my buddy, we're going to roll this thing open. And if we see this guy, we may be convinced that he is the Son of God. And we're going to let him out. Or we may be so spooked by, oh my gosh, it's this guy. And we just may run just as an instinctual feeling. There's ways that he could have just been let out. And so again, when we have that other story about the women coming to wash his body, the guards are missing, the tomb is open, and Jesus is also missing from the tomb. So that would also be explained through some version of the apparent death theory. Let's see if the authors address any of this. First, enemies and friends alike believed Jesus was dead. The Romans, who were professional executioners, whipped and beat Jesus brutally to the point of his collapse. They then drove heavy, wrought iron nails through his wrists and feet and plunged a spear into his side. They didn't break his legs to speed death because they knew he was already dead. Crucifixion victims often died by asphyxiation because they couldn't push themselves up to breathe. Breaking the legs would therefore speed death. Moreover, Pilate checked to make sure Jesus was dead, and Jesus' death was the reason the disciples had lost all hope. The brutal Roman crucifixion techniques have been verified through archaeology and non-Christian written sources. Okay, yeah, they're brutal. We're not denying that. In 1968, the remains of a first-century crucifixion victim were found in a Jerusalem cave. The heel bone of this man had a 7-inch nail driven through it, and his lower arms had showed evidence of nails as well. The spear in the heart has also been verified as a Roman crucifixion technique by Roman author Quintilian. Given such a treatment of Jesus, it's no wonder eyewitnesses thought he was dead. Not only did those first century believe that he was dead, modern medical doctors also believe that Jesus actually died. Writing in the March 21, 1986 edition of the Journal of American Medical Association, 3 medical doctors, including a pathologist from the Mayo Clinic, concluded, quote, "Clearly the weight of historical medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted and supports a traditional view that the spear thrust between his right rib probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge." Let us actually check out that footnote. So the footnote leads us here, and this is something that I'm going to have to check out in the future and just posted another video about it, just to see what they have to say. As we indicated in the last chapter, the blood and water from the spear wound appears to be another genuine eyewitness detail from the pen of John. That fact alone should end all doubt about the death of Jesus. The second major flaw in the swoon theory is that Jesus was embalmed in 75 pounds of bandages and spices. It is highly unlikely that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus would have mistakenly embalmed a living Jesus. That's like saying, well, it's very unlikely that somebody would have buried a living body. Third, even if everyone is wrong about Jesus being dead when he went into the tomb, how could a badly injured and bleeding man still be alive 36 hours later? That's where I kind of was with this at the beginning. I went with the, okay, yeah, what if he didn't die theory? How could we explain some of the tomb stuff, with being rolled open or the guards being missing or the guards being passed out? But really, I don't think somebody in that condition is reasonably going to live through it. He would have bled to death in that cold, damp, dark tomb. Fourth, even if he did survive the cold, damp, dark tomb, how could he unwrap himself, move the 2-ton rock away from the inside of the tomb, get by the elite Roman guards who would have been killed for allowing a breach of security, and convince the scared, scattered, skeptical cowards that he had triumphed over death? Well, I've explained 2 ways that could have happened with the Roman guards either passed out, run away, or they opened the tomb themselves. And then how could he convince the scared, scattered, skeptical cowards he had triumphed over death? Just walk up to them and say, hey, what's up? Even if he could have gotten out of the tomb and passed the Roman guards, Jesus would have been a battered, bleeding pulp of a man whom the disciples would pity, not worship. They'd say, you may be alive, but you're certainly not risen. Let's get you to a doctor. I mean, that's cute, but this is where I'm kind of leaning towards this idea that perhaps a person could have been convinced that they are now inhabited by the body of Christ, given themselves a stigmata. And the reason is because why would he have those wounds? Why would he heal himself of everything else? Stop the bleeding, stitch together or reseal his open wounds, and somehow forgot to seal up the holes. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would all of his crucifixion and torture wounds, the broken ribs, all of this stuff, why would that be completely healed except the holes? It's convenient to say, oh yeah, we can prove it's him because look at his hands. They have that evidence of, or look at his wrists, they have the stigmata evidence. But why is he missing all the other injuries? And if he could heal the other injuries, why didn't he heal the holes? Not the best writing, but if I was a person who really wanted to believe it's true and I believed myself to be the next embodiment of Christ, I could say, well, yeah, Jesus is now in my body. And when he came into my body, I was shown that this really happened because these crucifixion wounds showed up, which is what some stigmata patients believe. They believe they've been witnessed to or touched by Christ in a way, and to prove that this happened, that's where the stigmata appears. And that's, again, it's kind of bizarre because why would only the stigmata appear? Why not the rest of the crucifixion wounds? Why are these people picking at holes in their hands or holes in their wrists, depending on which Jesus version they believe in? Because if you guys weren't aware, the stigmata shows up in the hands or it shows up in the wrists, depending on your church's use of where the nails go. Interesting stuff. Totally true and absolutely not self-harm at all, right? Fifth, the swoon theory cannot explain Jesus' bright light appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus. Well, this is not... I'm really surprised that the authors are including this as, oh yeah, this is a physical manifestation. The reason for this is that Saul, so before he's Paul, he's traveling with other people, and he's the only one that sees this. It's not as if Jesus teleported and showed up in this bright light and appeared to Saul and his traveling companions, said some stuff, and then disappeared. And then everybody was like, wow, what an amazing thing that just happened. It was an incident only for Paul or Saul. And that's the part that I'm kind of surprised they included it, because if it was a genuine physical appearance of Christ, why would it only appear to one person in the group? What turned around this avowed enemy of Christianity shortly after the crucifixion? It certainly wasn't a normal human being who had healed from his crucifixion experience. Well, I don't think it was any human being. I don't think it was any being. I think it was a vision. Or I think it was a story. There's a good chance that Paul or Saul wasn't really making any friends with his actions, and maybe he noticed, hey, you know what, this whole Christian thing, if I get in early, kind of like an MLM, if it's a new MLM and you get in on that like early ground level, you've got the best chance at making the most money. Saul could have just been saying, hey, you know what, I'm totally converted and now I'm going to be this major leader in the church. And he kind of was, wasn't he? That's why he's the one that is being spoken to. He's the one writing letters of recommendation of how to do this and recommending that people do that. He's seen as kind of an authority in the church because he got in early. He may have just been a really good scam artist. Isn't that more likely? Even if he's not feeling guilty about it. Let's say he's totally okay with killing guys and persecuting them, he's fine with it. That's a lot of work though, right? It's a lot of work to go chase people down and harm them. And if that's not what you're into, if you're not wanting to hurt people and wanting to even if you are, again, it's just a lot of work. A lot less work is just casually writing letters because people think you're awesome. People are sending you stuff. They think you're a cool celebrity when you show up. That seems pretty reasonable. Paul's description of his conversion is recorded twice in the historically authenticated book of Acts. In chapter 22, Paul tells a hostile Jewish crowd about Christ's appearance to him. About noon, I came near Damascus. Suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting, he replied. Paul was then blinded for 3 days and experienced a 180-degree attitude change. He went from Christianity's most eager enemy to his most ardent advocate. Doesn't that sound like a lot of pastors? Do we have outside evidence for Paul or Saul being a guy who goes around and harms Christians? Because this just sounds like a pastor's testimony, doesn't it? Oh, I was so against God, and then, man, I had this experience, and God told me, you need to knock it off, and you need to come to me, and then that's how I came to God, and I fell on my face, and I was just a changed man after that. This sounds like a pastor's testimonial. Is Paul, is that our first fake testimonial? Getting in early, you're going to be making the big bucks. This is something we know that happens. So why would we assume that it's more likely he actually was met face to face by Jesus? Paul's conversion experience cannot be explained by a swooned Jesus wielding a torch and using his God voice from the bushes. What? I don't see why they think he physically appeared. I mean, most Christians don't think he physically appeared. We were never taught that in church, that he physically appeared to Paul. We were taught that Saul had an experience with Jesus. He had a vision from Jesus. That's what we were taught. Interesting they're going with this angle. This was a dramatic display of divine power in broad daylight that dramatically changed a man and the world forever. Again, could just be one of those cheap dime a dozen testimonials, except it's the first one. Sixth, several non-Christian writers affirm that Jesus had died by crucifixion. These included Josephus, Tacitus, Thallus, and the Jewish Talmud. Jewish Talmud, for example, says that Yeshua was hung on a tree on the eve of Passover. This is not a source considered friendly to Christianity, so there's no reason to doubt its authenticity. They're just saying stuff that the people believe. Like with Josephus, they're talking about, Josephus was writing about this is what Christians believe. He didn't say, oh, I saw it myself and that's how I know it happened and I checked too and yeah, the dude was totally dead. I don't think that these are useful to this argument. For these reasons and others, we'll cite the others. Very few scholars believe the swoon theory anymore. There's simply too much evidence against it. The disciples stole the body. Okay, let's check it out. The theory that the disciples stole Jesus' body cannot support the skeptic's last option, that the New Testament writers were all deceived. Why? Because this theory makes the New Testament writers the deceivers, not the deceived ones. This, of course, flies in the face of all the evidence we've seen so far. The theory takes an untenable position that the New Testament writers were all liars. For some inexplicable reason, they stole the body in order to get themselves beaten, tortured, and martyred. Well, no, that... Do I even have to explain how stupid that is? You guys aren't that dumb to understand why that's a stupid statement. These authors, they are really just here to insult everybody's intelligence, aren't they? Adherents to this theory cannot explain why anyone would do this. Yeah, because they're not saying that. This is a strong... Are you... Why would the disciples embark on such a self-defeating conspiracy? This is your argument against it? This is your argument against it. This is so stupid. Oh, I can't... I'm losing it. I'm losing it. This... And why did every one of them continue to say that Jesus had risen from the dead when they could have saved themselves by recanting testimony? Again, we don't have the evidence of that. In addition to the disciples' severe conflict of interest, adherents of this theory cannot explain other absurdities required by their theory. For example, how did the disciples get past the elite Roman guards who were trained to guard the tomb with their lives? If Jesus never rose from the dead, then who appeared to Paul? Well, okay, well, we're gonna just... Can I delete it? Backspace? Because that's stupid. That's a stupid argument there. That who appeared to Paul, James, and the other eyewitnesses? Nobody appeared to Paul. A vision appeared to Paul at best. And we can't trust the other eyewitnesses and James that Paul talks about because Paul doesn't list any of the eyewitnesses, and we know that's a tactic for liars to bolster their lie and make it sound more reasonable. And then in the next verse he mentions, and also James. So these 500 unnamed guys that you could just totally ask any of them right now, plus James. There's no reason for us to... Okay. So how did they get past the elite Roman guards who were trained to guard the tomb? I don't know. Bribery? That they were the ones that spooked the guards? Maybe they were the ones that were throwing things. They could have done something to distract the guards. There's so many reasons why the guards would leave their post. Plus, is it the elite Roman guards? Are those the guys that you're really going to put on tomb duty? Tomb duty is like a no-brainer. You're just standing there and making sure, hey, don't let anybody roll away this rock, okay? Oh, by the way, you gotta stand there all night. You're not putting your best, like, Marines on that duty. You're putting the Marines you can spare. They're not the elite. Yes, all Marines are trained the same way, etc., but there's some of them that they're like 1 or 2 standard deviations off to the left. They're kind of lazy, and the lazy ones we always name Army of One. They're those guys. Those are the guys you put on duty. The ones that are either new, so they're not trained enough to be given other tasks, and hey, you know, everybody's got to do duty rotation anyway. We all had to do it. I did duty rotation. Everybody has to do like 24-hour duty rotation. But when I first got to my duty station, that was my first post for a month, was standing battalion duty. That was it. 24 hours on, 24 hours off. And that's pretty common. That's where you put the noobs. That's where you put people being punished. Hey, you know, you just got busted down, and as punishment, we're also adding you're on 24-hour duty because somebody's got to stand duty. You don't put your best guards doing that. You put the guys that they want to go home and they're not used to staying up and they're kind of tired. Maybe both of them just legitimately fell asleep and then they were hit over the head with rocks by the disciples to knock them out, and then maybe they might have even killed them for all we know. We don't hear about these guards ever again. They may have been hit over the head to kind of keep them knocked out and they actually died. We have no idea. You don't put your best on guard duty, especially for a dead body. A dead body, and you got like the scrappy ragtag team of these ex-fishers. Yeah, that's where I'm gonna put my best. Come on. These are just off the top of my head, more reasonable sounding arguments. There's a lot of excellent YouTube channels that do that. And they go through and they teach you about why all the stuff the authors are saying is completely wrong. Here's the historical context. And I love it when you guys add that in the comments section. I really appreciate it. But the reason I don't do that is just to show how bad these arguments are on their face. Yes, if there's a time when I can use my own experience, like the Roman guards standing duty, great. But this is stuff that I'm not having to research. And I'm coming up with more reasonable explanations. Wasn't one of these guys in the military too? One of them was. We looked it up. He was in the Navy. He knows these are not the best guards. You're not putting your best. Ugh. Did the New Testament writers lie about their conversions too? Did Paul simply make up the evidence found in 1 Corinthians? Well, what evidence, right? But I already said that, didn't I? I said he could have just made it up for a good testimony. Okay, yes, maybe he did. And what about the non-Christian writers? Did Josephus lie about James being martyred by the Sanhedrin? Not necessarily, but that doesn't mean anything. It just means James was martyred by the Sanhedrin. There's no evidence that if he would have recanted, that he would have been spared this. That's kind of like if you break the law already and the crime that you do is punishable by death. You can't just say, oh yeah, I undo it, uno reverse, it didn't happen. Okay, you guys are gonna let me go now, right? That's what the authors want us to believe. That the crime of spreading Christianity is punishable by death. And that if you're caught spreading Christianity, that all you have to do is just say, oh, I was just playing around, you guys. I don't really believe that stuff. I was just being an edgelord. Okay, let me go now. The authors really believe that they would have just let them go. That... That's what they really believe. Why would you be able to recant and then go away? Did the Roman writer Phlegon, born circa 80 CE, otherwise it's AD, lie as well when he wrote in his chronicles, Jesus while alive was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment, as showed his hands had been pierced by nails. And then there's another footnote for 10. This is a guy who was born after the alleged death and ascension of Jesus, quite some time after. So he doesn't know that Jesus while alive was of no assistance to himself, that he arose after death, and that he showed everybody his marks and showed his hands had been pierced by nails. He doesn't know that. He didn't see it. This is going to be just like Josephus, where he's writing what other people say, and even if he believes it, even if he's an actual Christian, he writes this down in the Chronicles because he's a Christian, even if that's the case, he's still never witnessed it. It's just something that other Christians say. So that's not special to me. Oh, some guy heard some stuff and wrote it down? Cool. It would take more of a miracle for all this to happen than for Jesus to rise from the dead, and we don't have enough faith to believe all that. Well, Norm and Frank, if you guys are watching this, I guess Norm, if you're watching this from the great beyond, do you have enough faith to believe my explanation? Because it's pretty straightforward, simple stuff that we know happens in everyday life. Or do you still believe the miraculous stuff?